Today we have in our special interview Richard Napier, the coordinator of the Global Anti-Corruption in the US State Department. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So before we straightway go to the interview, let me introduce with our viewers who is Richard Napier. Richard assumed his office in July last year, and before assumed as the coordinator in the Global Anti-Corruption, he served in Columbia University. So prior to that, Richard also earlier worked with the State Department as a Deputy Special Envoy for Iran, Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanction Policy, and Director for Iran on the National Security Staff. So without further ado, we straightway go to our interview. You arrived here last morning, if I'm not wrong, already been with the Foreign Secretary Masoud bin Momen, the Secretary of the ACC and other stakeholders like TIB. So probably you touched upon the issues of anti-corruption, money laundering, this and that. Can you shed some light, cooperation between Bangladesh and USA on the issues of precisely corruption and money laundering?
Sure. Well, I think the United States and Bangladesh are working together to address this common challenge, this common problem that we face and that frankly the rest of the international community faces as well. I think part of the reason why I came to Dhaka was to be able to learn a little bit more about the challenges that Bangladesh is facing, the challenges with corruption that the country and the people are working through, and to see whether or not there are additional ways in which we can support one another, and additional ways that we can cooperate and work together. So I think the relationship is good. I think that there is work that we're doing together, but part of my job is to investigate whether or not there are improvements and changes that can be made. And so it was quite useful to come and do a little bit of fact-finding directly here.
When we touched upon the issues of money laundering, these days these are the much talked about issue in our country, and most prominently the countries like Switzerland, Canada and US have come up on the money laundering. When talking to reporters, the ACC Secretary yesterday mentioned that you touched upon the issues of money laundering and the new ways of or path to curb this sort of criminal activities, because we know the money laundering at the end of the day put a huge scars on the society. It's a terror finance, either criminal activities or human trafficking. So can you precise on these particular issues, what are the new mechanism or paths that you touched upon during your visit these times in Bangladesh?
Yeah, I mean, so I think as you put it, illicit actors have to find some way of moving their money around, and they want to often do so in a way that allows it to be, at least appear clean when it gets to the other side. I think there's a lot of new tools and new techniques that money launderers are using. There's certainly a lot of new financial mechanisms and transit points that they're using to try and engage in these activities. I think a lot of the discussions I had with your government authorities were about how we can work together to investigate and identify those kinds of activities, and how we may be able to address them working together. Certainly there are already relationships that exist between U.S. and Bangladeshi authorities, including with the financial intelligence units in both of our countries. And I think as all of us are working to address this problem, there are ways that we can strengthen that cooperation.
You mentioned that there is already a mechanism with the financial intelligence unit. Also, when we talk about this particular issue, we have so in our neighboring countries with India, we have mutual legal assistance treaty or something like that. Are you planning to put something, this sort of mechanism, so that both the countries can effectively help each other to curb the problem?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to get any specifics about where certain activities and cooperation can go. I think it's worth stating at the outset though that there are already existing relationships and activities and cooperation that exists. The FBI, for instance, already works closely with colleagues here in Bangladesh.
FBI directly engaged with colleagues here in Bangladesh in the issues of money laundering that you mentioned?
In the issues of fighting crime collectively, of which an element of that is money laundering. The Financial Intelligence Unit has a relationship with the U.S. FinCEN, which is our financial intelligence unit. So there are already a number of different ways in which we're working together, government to government. And of course, the U.S. Embassy is the primary point through which a lot of these activities can be pursued. I think the key point to take away is that there are always ways in which we can build on our existing cooperative relationships to try and address new challenges that exist and to ensure that we are leaving no opportunity for bad actors to get away. And so I think one of the things that I'm going to take back to Washington with me from the conversations I had is ways in which we might be able to identify and strengthen the relationship that we have and points where we can find new ways of working together.
You mentioned that the two countries now enjoying very fantastic cooperation on the issues of money laundering and corruption already. You have some sort of different ways of cooperation. Recently, we seek support from the Switzerland, particularly list of people who in recent years sending funds from Bangladesh territory to US, something like that, and also there are discussion with Canada on the same issue. Whether Bangladesh seek any support from the Washington recently to get the list of people who transfer money or launder money from our territory to the US soil.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on any specifics of our engagement and how we were talking about or working about, engagement with the rest of the international community. Suffice to say, there are a number of different ways in which we can work together to try and address the issue of safe haven and address the issue of where money is going. Obviously, it's both a part of the UN Convention Against Corruption as well as a moral obligation, I think, that we all feel to ensure that that Bangladesh, as well as any other country that's money diverted from legitimate purposes through corruption, is able to get that repatriated. And I think it's a core element of the U.S. strategy to fight corruption, to try and ensure that asset recovery and return of assets that have left countries as a result of criminal activity are repatriated, and that we find ways to prevent those activities from taking place in the future. And I think we'll be able to identify additional avenues to work together on both of those things.
What actually US do when they found that person A, B or C are engaged in the money laundering? I mean, what sort of tool US actually put when they found people who are termed or dubbed as a money launderers?
Yeah, I mean, so the United States has got a variety of tools that we can use. The first off is an asset freeze, where you can, through administrative procedures, tell a financial institution that it shouldn't allow money to move around any further to avoid it escaping from jurisdictions. And of course, prosecutions can also take place, as well as information sharing with countries where you might have had assets come from. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use to both arrest the funds in question, potentially arrest the people in question, and then to ensure that that there is a repatriation of the funds. Now, of course, all of those things involve legal rules and having to follow procedures and similar. And I think those activities also require a lot of evidence. And so some of the ways in which we already work together and I think can continue to work together is in making sure that information is shared about indications of corrupt activity as well as money laundering activity and similar to try and engage with each other more closely.
Whether US put any sort of sanction or punitive action if the person who stays in his own territory and transfer the fund on the US soil?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the bigger issue of sanctions is that we have the ability through our national legislation to impose sanctions on actors that have engaged in corruption or the transfer of funds related to corruption. It's contained in what we call the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program.
Yeah.
It's very explicit that corrupt actors, those who provide material support to them, and those who facilitate the transfer of funds can have sanctions imposed against them. The United States has used these sanctions tools in the past, and we would be prepared to use these tools again in the future where the facts warrant it. So again, I can't necessarily speak to any specific case, but do we have these tools and will we be willing to use them? The answer is yes.
You put sanction only for money laundering or corruption too? That's my precise question.
Yeah, so the
For example, you find substantive evidence against an individual who are engaged in the serious corruption. So that's why I'm asking whether you put the tools like sanction both for money laundering as well as the huge corruption.
Money laundering, this is where money laundering can be a little bit of a sticky issue, right? If money laundering is undertaken facilitating corrupt activity or the transfer of corrupt funds, then money laundering would fall within that sanctions program. Other sanctions programs may also involve being able to target those who are engaged in money laundering. But for that, I think you'd want to be able to have a more concrete discussion with some of our officials who are currently responsible for sanctions tools.
Okay. When the issue of sanction come up, people from this part of the world feel that it could be used as a political tool or something like that. Since you were serving in the OFAC earlier, can you shed some light how the sanction issue evolved, or how you put a particular institution or individual in the sanction list?
It's very clear, and I say at the outset, we do not use our sanctions tools for political purposes. So we do not identify individuals with one political party and decide to impose sanctions against them. Our sanctions programs are all conduct-based. So if we have found that anyone has involved in significant corruption, we then have the sanctions tools that are necessary to impose consequences on them, including asset freezes and visa restrictions. So from that standpoint, while there may be a sense that there is a political element to it, the reason why sanctions are imposed is because of bad conduct, because of illicit conduct, and to try and avoid that conduct from threatening U.S. national security, and to avoid the risks that could come from these bad actors getting away with things. You asked the question, could sanctions be imposed overnight? We do not describe and discuss in advance the use of these sanctions tools that we have, in part because to do so would give individuals an opportunity to escape and to evade the impact of sanctions. And so when a decision is made that sanctionable conduct has taken place, the U.S. will act, and will act when it believes that evidence is sufficient.
How much time it usually requires to make a conclusive decision on the sanction?
Yeah.
It will take 3 months, 6 months or so, something like that. As you mentioned, you will decide on the substantial evidence on putting place any sanction or any sort of restrictive actions.
Yeah. So, sanctions investigations can take a long time because they are part of a rule of law mechanism. So they have to be based on evidence. They have to be able to be supported and defended in court. So from that standpoint, we don't do them overnight from the standpoint of today we decided we were going to impose sanctions and tomorrow we'll do so. There's always evidence. There's always rules and procedures that are followed. But really it depends a lot on the cases in question. In some cases the evidence is very clear, it's very concrete, it's very direct, and so investigations can be accomplished very quickly. In other cases it takes more time. But the process starts and stops with evidence being gathered, information being gathered to support a sanctions decision, and then for the actions to be imposed as a consequence.
My last question. There is a perception, section of people in Bangladesh feel that corrupted people put their money or pass their money from Bangladesh to US, and countries like US, Canada are the safe haven for money laundering. And though you raise voice on the corruption and other thing, you still allow them. So what is your views on this?
So the United States is very clear that we, like other countries, still have work to do to address the issues of corruption in our country. And that includes the risk that assets could come from other countries into the United States. If you read the U.S. strategy on countering corruption, it's very clear that one of our priorities is denying safe haven. That's not just denying safe haven outside in the rest of the world, but also denying safe haven inside the United States. So there are a number of different regulatory steps that are being undertaken now under existing law, as well as new pieces of legislation that could be passed to try and address the gaps that might exist in our regulatory framework. And that's to avoid precisely this kind of problem. And let me say in this part as well, I think one of the main things that we are very clear on is we're willing to be criticized when it comes to issues of fighting corruption, because we know that we're not perfect, and we know that we've got challenges too. And we think that's why it's important that investigative journalists, civil society actors, and others need to not only have the right to point out where we have issues and flaws and things that could be fixed, but actually, frankly, a responsibility to identify those problems so that we can work on them together. So we think it's incredibly important that governments embrace and support civil society actors, journalists, and others, even when they're asking tough questions, because that's the only way we can fix our common problem, that of corruption, and try and fight it more effectively. So, to me, I think there will always be, a desire to ask those tough questions, to get tough answers as a result, and then work together to try and improve and address the systems that we have to fight corruption together.
So thank you, Richard, for giving us your time. Do you have a hectic schedule? Once again, we hope to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So dear viewers, with this we are end of the interview, and hope to see you again with another new guest. Thank you.